My name is Alfred Ojukwu. I am a Surface TSP. I've been with Microsoft for about 7 years. Actually, 7 years yesterday. That was my anniversary, so 7 years at Microsoft now. I was with services, and now I'm in technical sales, and I focus on Surface devices. The irony of that is when you go from driving the EMS business or the Intune and all those pieces to hardware, you go from talking about software and what's going on in the operating systems to selling really shiny devices. So it's definitely a contrast. So if you start hearing me talk about Surfaces, you know why. So again, welcome this morning. I'm also a Microsoft certified trainer. I've been a Microsoft certified trainer for over 10 years now, and I spend a lot of time making sure that I'm up to speed on, the Windows Server 2016 exams, the Windows client exams, so all the 7698s and all of those. So we're going to see some of that as we go through it. The key objective today that we want to be able to do is make sure you guys understand how to prepare for 7697. Now, with a show of hands, how many people have taken an exam while they're here at Tech Ready so far? And okay, so it's 1 or 2. And anybody know about the discounts while you're here? It's a 50% discount. So this is the time to do it, right? If you're here and you're really thinking about getting that certification done, this is when you do it. Why do you want to get certified? Again, and these are things I want to go over as we talk about this, is it's really important to make sure that you have that on your resume. I'm a big fan of LinkedIn now these days because it really does a good job of promoting your skills and preparing you for opportunities if you're looking for new roles, if you're looking for new promotions, if you're looking for new challenges. So the certification tracks are really there to make sure that you can differentiate yourself amongst other people. Not necessarily to make sure that you're the smartest guy in the room, but to make sure that you know exactly how you can deliver a solution to a customer. So the first one you'll see is the Microsoft Certified Solutions Associate, which is the MCSA. If you take a single exam, you then have your Microsoft Certified Solutions Associate credentials. So again, this might be someone that has 1 to 2 years of experience. You might, you might do a lot of work with hands-on labs and just working through scenarios with customers. But in here, notice here it says requiring you have to pass 2 exams, and once you pass those 2 exams, you have the Solutions Associate. But then you can go into getting your MCSC if you pass at least 3. And once you reach that, you become a certified. Used to be engineer, but expert. So the Solutions Associate is where we want you to start. We tend to notice that these courses are now much more focused on the cloud, and just out of curiosity, how many people are focused, the roles are basically moving towards cloud technologies, and hopefully everybody in this room should somehow, unless you're government, everybody knows it is what it is, cloud-focused exams. So you'll see these exams start talking more about cloud technology, specifically Azure, right? So and device management being this piece, you'll hear a lot about Intune and Intune platform, and we'll go over much of that today. And then the content continues to get updated. That's the big thing that you'll see now. And also, as the new exams get released in FY17, FY18, you'll see information gets updated quite quickly. So we might cover quite a bit of content today. If you decide to take the exam 6 months from now, they may update it with some of the changes that are happening with Windows as a service. So make sure that you're aware of those changes as they're happening, and I'll show you, some neat tricks on how to be able to do that. Again, basic exam tips. You have about 40 to 60 questions, and I didn't ask this before, but how many people have taken an exam, period, in the last 1 year? Last 5 years. It should have been the other way around, right? Well, that's good. The majority of you guys have taken the exam. That's good. The important thing to remember is that you have about 1 to 3 hours. I tend to try to, if the exam's fairly easy, I run in there, try to take it as much, complete it as quickly as possible. But you have 3 hours, so take your time. And the one thing that we always try to reinforce, you don't have to have 1,000 on the exam. People ask me that question all the time. What do I need to do to pass the exam? You just need a 700. So if you have 40 to 60 questions and you're going through it and you have 3 hours to get through this exam, What you want to do is focus on the ones that you know and you have answers for, and write down the ones that you don't have answers for. Then you come back to those and you spend the other 2 hours on those until you get those right. And we'll work through how to eliminate what those questions are and get to that answer. Quick question?
Most of the new ones are 2 hours.
So the comment was most of the new ones are 2 hours, but you still have 3 hours to complete it. No.
2 hour time limit.
Also, then they must, there are some exams that are 3 hours. Maybe not these, but there are some exams that give you 3 hours. But again, you're going to have to go with whatever the requirements are when you're taking the exam. So that way you can get through it. And you can include up to 20 different types of questions. We talked about the fact that you have multiple choice. You have drag and drop, moving it from one side to the other. You have, the option where you're basically selecting the setting in the actual app to say, this is where I can make that change. As we kind of go forward, you can see where the paths are. We're essentially focused on the productivity. Where am I? I can't even see it. The mobility. There's a mobility platform. At the top. There you go. I can't see. It's my deck, and I can't even tell you where it's at. At the top here is the mobility track. So you'll have those MCSAs for Windows 10, and it really requires that you take a set of exams, 7697. If you've ever gone to the mcp.microsoft.com, you'll be able to see that path to see what you need in terms of preparing yourself for the exam. And at some point we'll go into that and we'll kind of talk about what that looks like. But it's the quickest way to make sure that you're on the right path. Hopefully many of you guys have already started doing that, and you've at least looked at where you are to figure out what you need in order to get done. That's one thing I like about it, is because now you have a little bit more insight as to what's missing from your exam preparation process and where to prepare for, what material you need. And we'll go over some of that at the very end just to make sure you guys are aware. All right. So this one kind of gives you the framework where you have 7697 and 7698. My buddy Chris is going to be covering 7698 later on. The 697 is configuring Windows devices. What is the difference? The difference essentially is that the Windows devices is more focused on a cloud-based technology, so mobile device management, not necessarily Windows 10, but Intune-based device management, what that means from a holistic standpoint. And then also, the configuring Windows 10 is focused more on just Windows 10, installing it, configuring it. Not a whole lot is different. You can actually study for the 2 exams at about the same time. And you also see that you still have electives. So the 398, which is particularly around planning and managing devices, mobile devices, and you have options for 695 and 696. So if you are a mobile administrator, how many people manage mobile devices in the organization? This is the exam for you. These are the exams for you. I have this track. This is probably one of my favorite tracks, which is why I always want to get in there and cover it. But it really does take you down that path. So let's get down to the material, right? So we have about 10 different categories of content. Now, we've done this on Virtual Academy. If you ever look up on Microsoft Virtual Academy, we've done a ton of recording on the configuring Windows devices exams, where we break down each one of these sections. And essentially, that's what we're going to do here in the next 70 minutes. We'll talk about what it means to prepare for the exam. And my intentions, our intentions, I would say our intentions, but Joe's not here. My intention is to make sure that we cover the content so that you can find what you don't know, right? There's a lot of content in here. But the idea is it's not about what you know, it's about what you don't know and how to make sure that you can prepare for it. So let's go ahead and start exposing that, and we'll start with managing identities. So identity is basically the core piece of this that it starts off with. It's looking at how are you logging on to the systems, how do you sideload applications, what accounts do you use to actually do that authentication, and what's available. So you can see it goes into work groups, domains versus home groups, credential manager, anything that has to do with how you log on to the PC itself. They're looking to make sure you understand that knowledge from a usage standpoint. Now again, with all the changes that are happening with Windows 10 and how it functions, that's what they're testing you on. If you're on Windows 7, if you're on Windows 8, you may get challenged on understanding what the difference is from that old technology, I call it old, but it's really just, older technology, to the Windows 10 platform. So in that, you kind of see we start off with supporting Windows Store and the cloud apps. So this really goes into what's in the store, how do I actually use it, and what are the things that you need to know. Real quick, we have here an exam tip, which is basically add Apex package. In other words, what would I need to do and if I needed to do some sort of side loading process. And it kind of shows you a quick path of the actual PowerShell command line. No PowerShell for these exams. If anyone's taking exams in the last 2 to 3 years, PowerShell is a big portion of this, and it's important that you understand how that fits into the framework. So I'm just going to jump over to my other system here. So this is just a normal Windows 10 system. I'm just going to do a quick search on the store. And the easiest way to prepare for the exam is to just jump over to the lab, and just get in there and kind of look around and see what's there, because they're going to be testing you on little things. From this standpoint, they're looking at you to understand what the sign-in requirements are. Remember, you can still have a Microsoft account. You can also use a corporate account at the same time. The Windows Store for Business is that corporate account, because then you're allowed to access your corporate data. This is where those settings will be found. You essentially have to put those credentials, and then from there, you're able to kind of see what those options are. Be familiar with that. Also, we talk about what the sign-in options are. What are the sign-in options for being able to sign on to the system? We have at least 4 different ways. We have Windows Hello, password PIN, picture passwords. Each one of these can be controlled through group policy, right? So if I go into the group policy and I pull up computer configurations, let's see if I can. I go into security settings and account policies. This is another place you need to sort of make sure you're aware of what's there. So let's see. Policies, hang on 1 second. Okay, sorry. So under security options, you'll see there's a number of different options that you can actually use for, sort of deciding on what you're going to do with it. So if we take just a quick look at this, a good example is block Microsoft accounts. So they might ask you questions around what are the changes in policies that you might see on the system. So you just have to be kind of familiar with, what those changes look like and what you're going to do with them. So this is an example of, knowing that there's a block Microsoft accounts option in the group policies. So policy settings are things you're going to get challenged on. So just make sure you're at least familiar with them and you can take a look at them as you're going through your exam preparation steps. So as we go forward, configuring group policies, what that looks like, sideloading applications. This command gives you sort of an idea of how you would go about sideloading those applications on that system. And the key factors to keep in mind is you're still dealing with authentication. Multi-factor authentication will come up over and over and over on this exam because of what it does is basically allow you to have multiple factors, 2-factor. Some people say 2-factor, some people say multi-factor. How do you log on to that system and what comes into play when you're using that? Remember that Windows Hello is a part of that. Remember that you might use certificates. Remember that you might have to deal with the TPM, the Trusted Platform Module, which is part of the Windows 10. All of these are sign-in options. So as you're going through the exams, they might give you a case study of a specific scenario with a customer where they're asking you, what are the options that you can turn on? They don't want to use biometrics, for example. Then you might want to disable the use of Windows Hello or the fingerprint option or facial recognition. And then just remember, some of the features are coming in, like dynamic lock, which is a newer feature with 1703. When you walk away from the device, it basically locks it, knowing that you're no longer around it with the device that's next to it. And then just setting the different requirements on PIN. You might have to set up a PIN. That might be a way of providing additional forms of authentication. Also, the other piece that is of interest is also knowing just the options around logging on. And this one comes up a bit too. Again, I don't want to overstress it, but again, I want to make sure that you guys understand that they will ask you about these scenarios. So understand that when you click on the connect option, make sure that you walk through the process of joining a system to Azure AD or not. So in this case, This machine is already joined to Azure AD, so I can't show you what it looks like. But if you did have the option, you would see a column here that says join Azure AD, and actually I can show it here on number 6. Now, I won't actually do it, but I'll at least show it to you so you can be familiar with it. So many of the questions you'll get will be right in the actual settings app, no longer in the older systems MMC snap-in. So just make sure that if you see a number of questions that are coming up, focus on looking for it in the settings app, and that's one of those key things that we have to kind of keep in mind. So the sign-in options I mentioned, make sure you know what those are, and then the piece that I was mentioning is connecting to your work or school. So once you put that information on, this piece right there, join the device to Azure Active Directory, join a device to local Active Directory, know the difference. They're going to ask you that question. When you join a device to Azure Active Directory, what happens is it registers the device with a GUID. Information is registered in Azure Active Directory, and if you want that object to show back up on-premise, you have to enable device write back. But it actually requires Azure AD Connect. The other piece is if you join into the local Active Directory, obviously you need to be connected to that corporate network, and if not, you have to be on a VPN. So little things like that will get people know the difference between what Azure Active Directory does and what it doesn't do. So I won't do it in this machine because I think the guys will be upset with me if I join it. So we mentioned this piece. So for this section, you can see I kind of went through cursory with identity what that section covers. There's 9 or 10 other sections to go over. Know the deep links are going to come up. Microsoft Store for Business is a big deal. The Windows Hello and Windows Hello for Business. The fact that you can control the use of Windows Hello through group policies might come up on the exam. So make sure you're familiar with that. And the idea that you can use things like Azure AD Join, Workplace Join. Now, what technology is Workplace Join from? Does anybody know what version of Windows Workplace Join came with? Was introduced? A little bit further back. So which Windows version? Windows 8.1, right. So Workplace Join was a big piece of the Windows 8 movement. And then when we went to Windows 10, Azure AD Join became sort of the key aspect. So keep that in mind, because if you do have a question, they're asking you about Workplace Join, it's probably related to older technology. Not that it's old, but it's related to Windows 10. You can still do it with the systems now, but essentially Azure AD Domain Join is really what becomes the way of ensuring you have access to those resources. Okay, so that's on the exam. This is just a couple tips on this section 1 in case you guys have questions on it. So the next section is planning desktops and device deployment. So now we've gone through the identity piece. We're going to go into a little bit more around how do I make sure I can deploy that system, whether I'm using so this section actually covers Hyper-V, configuring user data, mobility options. What am I going to do to turn those settings on, as well as encrypting and protecting, securing that device. The irony in this exam right now is user state migration tool, which is USMT, is a way of transferring the existing data of users that are running on an older system or an existing system and moving into a new platform. But anybody know what technologies sort of what technologies have changed that requirement of having to use USMT all the time? Anybody know? In-place upgrade, exactly. So in-place upgrade is when you're going from Windows 7 to Windows 10, you automatically take advantage of migrating that user's data. Ironically, it actually uses what we know as USMT, right, to actually do that work, and it places that information on the separate partition on the local drive and moves it over for you as part of that. But for this exam, still know that USMT is a requirement. Kind of walk you through that, scan state, load state, make sure you know the difference between the two. And I've put a couple exam tips. The fact that you can run scan state, load state, but you have to run it as an admin before and after the deployment to make sure the data actually gets pushed out. You might want to use a specific profile. Know the difference between MIG apps, migration app, migration of the user, migration of the docs. One's focused on just the documents that are associated with the user. One is focused on the the user's information within their profile, and the other is focused on just the applications and the application settings. So these are things that you can actually determine in terms of options, how to actually do the migration. The other piece that comes up is Hyper-V. Now, Hyper-V settings are all part of the platform that you need to be available, to be aware of. They're not going to go too far deep into it about it. They just want to know that you know what Hyper-V is and how it works, and possibly know how to turn on different settings within Hyper-V, right? Again, because what Hyper-V runs on Server 2016 as well as Windows Server 2010, there are some slight differences. They're just looking to make sure you understand that Hyper-V can be enabled on Windows 10, and it can be used to provision VMs on that platform. Oh, and one other thing, right, we put this in here last time, the fact that you can actually run nested VMs. Anybody know what nested VMs are? Yeah, so nested VMs having Windows Server 2016 running, or Windows Server VM running another VM within that VM. So one of the benefits is now you can actually have labs within a lab, which is kind of cool, but it actually takes a lot of memory and CPU to get that running efficiently. But Hyper-V will come up on the exam, so make sure you're available, you're aware of that. And the other piece that you'll see in this exam is the BitLocker. BitLocker drive encryption. They'll ask you about BitLocker. They want to make sure you understand, you know, BitLocker, when you'd use it, how it actually works, and knowing that it becomes part of the actual deployment process. You want to be able to, you know, have BitLocker enabled or disable it during the actual rebuilding of the image, so you can actually, you know, pause it as part of that process. So I've listed out just examples of where you think about BitLocker, the algorithms around it, you know, how you use the group policies to manage BitLocker. And not so much MBAM, but if it does come up, just remember that MBAM is used to manage BitLocker as part of that platform. I've also added the network unlock feature. And this basically provides automatic unlock from the OS volume at a system reboots when it's connected to like the corporate network, as it says there. They might ask you about those things. And also remember, we put some of those requirements, for example, you know, having to have a UEFI system. Again, many of these systems that we have today, these modern systems, all have UEFI and DHCP drivers. These are some of the requirements that you have to kind of be aware of if you're using that. And so that's the network unlock feature. It's a pretty cool component that comes in as part of BitLocker. So this section really is around Hyper-V. It's expecting you to understand scan state, load state, understand what the difference is. So if you've ever or never or ever run scan state, load state, just look up the command. If you haven't seen it, look it up. And that's like my super exam tip. Look up what scan state, load state, and how it looks, so that you know what that language shows you. And then VMs, Hyper-V VMs, what do they do, how do they work, and what can you do with them? Again, with the nested VMs being available as part of 1607, that's also a big piece of this. The section 3 covers planning and managing for Microsoft Intune devices. Now, 398 exam actually covers this quite in depth. They only have one section that covers this. The piece of this is really focused on Intune. Now, ironically, we've just made this massive migration from where we were today on the old classic Intune portal to the new Intune Azure portal, right? How many people work in the portal.azure.com with Intune? Yeah, so you guys know this is like really where things are going. A lot of things are happening and changing there. And what you're going to start seeing in these exams is they're going to start having less focus on the old classic portal. So if you still have to know a little bit about the old classic portal, but what we're hoping to see is that the exams are going to be written with the new classic portal in mind. With that being said, a lot of the technology doesn't change, the conversation doesn't change. Know how to support mobile devices, understand what are the requirements for using the mobile devices, how would I deploy software using the mobile devices, for example. What types of applications can I deploy from Intune for using MSIs and things of that nature, and also what that means from a managing devices standpoint. Now, if you've ever worked with mobile device management, you understand that enrollment is a big part of it. Understanding whether you have the right MDM authorities is a big part of it. They will ask you questions around which making sure you know exactly which system is the MDM authority, whether it's SCCM, Configuration Manager, or if it's Intune, right? We know, I don't know if many of you guys know about the announcement around the hybrid scenario where we can actually have both managing it. That probably won't be around in those exams until at least another 6 months to a year. That's my guess. I could be wrong, but they're really just looking to make sure you understand that either you're going to be managing with SCCM or you're going to be managing devices in Intune. There are benefits and there are downfalls to both. One of the main benefits is the fact that you have a single console to manage devices. But really and truly, those devices that you enroll into SCCM still have to talk to Intune for the enrollment process, and they still know about it in Intune. It's all managed in the back end. So that's going to be something to be aware of. We talk about adding devices, making sure that the devices, when you enroll those devices, that they're registered and you can actually use it. I don't know if I have enough time to go into the console, but things to remember, and actually I will, things to remember is that you have the company portal. Make sure that you're familiar with what that process is in terms of finding the company portal and using the platform. So let's take a look real quick, and I'm just going to do some. This is just going to be on the Windows device itself. So remember that the company portal is available on all 3 platforms. Remember that you can actually install it on Windows 10. You can install it on Android devices. You can install it on iOS devices. The only one you really need it for are the Android and iOS. You don't need it for the Windows 10 unless you're going to manage applications. So you essentially have to know exactly where that is. And if they start asking you questions around Azure, managing Intune, I tend to tell folks just focus on portal.azure.com. Make sure that you've set up a tenant. How many people have an Intune tenant that they've played around with? If you haven't, the quickest way to get started is go to aka.ms/EMS-trial or EMS trial, either one. And it allows you to walk through setting up a demo tenant. This takes less than 5 minutes. Really setting it up and using it. You have 30 days to kind of play with it. So if you're trying to prepare for an exam, it's really easy to just now log in, set up a tenant, and start playing around with the features. They're really testing you and making sure you understand, what Intune can do. Again, I'm not going to go through and create it, but I already have one. And being able to kind of use it. So what's changed so far is all of the components there's 2 different flavors of Intune. You have Intune and you have Intune App Protection. Once you set this up, you can actually start enrolling devices. But one of the first things you'll have to do is make sure you select your MDM authority. They're going to be wanting to make sure that you understand how to set your MDM authority and what that looks like from a management standpoint. And again, from a learning standpoint, I really try to push you all to get into the console, portal.azure.com, using whatever account that you can use, understanding what the process is. Again, they're looking to make sure you understand what device enrollment process is. How do I enroll a device into management? What does that look like from a support standpoint? Let me actually switch here to... And making sure you understand what you can do on that platform. In other words, can I block devices? Can I wipe devices if I need to? In other words, do I have remote wipe? Also, they may ask you around Intune. They may ask you questions around Intune App Protection as well. How many people are familiar with what we used to call MAM without enrollment? Right. So MAM without enrollment is where I didn't have to actually enroll the device. I could just basically have the application available, push to the device, for example, Outlook, and configure it so that the user would receive policies specific to the application, but not on the whole device, right? So Intune App Protection, or MAM without enrollment, whatever you want to call it, is really focused on specific applications or enlightened applications that are going to help you basically manage access just to those applications. Each one of them come with a specific policy, for example. If I were to create one here, I could select a specific platform, and here are a number of different applications that I can actually pull into that platform. And once I set those applications, and again, this might be one of those examples where they actually walk through the UI and make sure you understand what that process is like. Play around with it. Look at the settings. once you have those applications, what that means is when the user logs in, downloads that application, and logs into that application using their corporate credentials, a set of policies will be pushed only for that app, not for the whole device, only for that app. You can run both at the same time. So if you get a question around Intune and Intune app protection, you can have both running at the same time. And there are a number of settings that you can control, whether you want to back up the data, whether you want to encrypt that information when the device is locked. You can set all that. And then also, other thing to remember is conditional access comes into play too. So after you set all these settings, I'm just going to go click OK on this and click Create for now. I have options for conditional access. And this is also part of the Intune platform and maybe something that you might get questions around. So conditional access is only providing access based on certain credentials. If I'm using Exchange, for example, I can say only allow access to this specific application, Exchange Online, using these applications. You can limit it to that and allow that as a parameter to prevent people from accessing it using other applications. So for example, if you use a native mail app in the iOS device and try to access the email account, it will prevent you from accessing it because it doesn't recognize that it's coming from a specific application running on that device. It has to be that Outlook. Each application has what we call an ID, and it knows the fact that you're using either Outlook or the native mail app, which is less protected. So little things will come out like that. So just kind of, if you do have a console, and make sure that you're kind of going around, testing out the different features, understand what it means to enroll devices, understand what it means to have that device managed within your console, because they're looking to make sure you understand what Intune is doing from a device management. Can we enroll Windows 10 in Intune? Anybody know? Can you enroll Windows 8.1 in Intune? Can you enroll Windows 7? So it's Windows 10. So you can enroll Windows 10. So Windows 10 is what you can enroll with Intune. It's going to be managed with Windows 10. You can manage devices, but it's only limited to those specific devices that we've just mentioned so far. Here's the Windows enrollment option. You can see just an example of what I have on my tenant now. I don't have much on here, but this is just all of the links that you're going to need to sort of prepare yourself for this exam are right here. Just go into the site, click on Help and Support for Intune, and it'll show you how that enrollment process looks like, and so that you're more familiar with that as well. All right, so let's keep going. Switch back. Again, this is just a quick example of the different options from the company portal. You have one for the Windows Phone. Each one of these sort of show you what that looks like from a management standpoint. There are different ways to deploy applications. So applications become another piece of this Windows 7 697 exam. I think it's a core component because just having a device isn't good enough. You need to have those applications delivered to those devices. So we talk about the different ways you can actually deliver an app to it, the software installation process, where I can actually deploy an MSI app, or I can redirect you to use the iOS, the Apple Store, or the Google Play Store. What we can do is we can configure that in Intune so that those users will actually route to those locations and pull those applications down to those systems. So we have the ability to deliver applications on any one of those platforms. The only one that is somewhat limited is the Windows 10, where you can actually use the MSIs and push those applications down to the system. In other words, if you're going to use anything outside of MSIs, executables, or much larger than that, in the context of this exam, you probably want to have SCCM installed on there, right? So if you get those exam questions that's asking you about, you need to deploy, Visio, well, Visio is a bad example. Any other application that might be a full app, you might want to use SCCM. There are ways to deploy Office through Intune now, so it's still there. It's just a newer feature, and hopefully that'll be an exam. So I kind of give you an example of how you install what you'd actually do in terms of Windows Phone, the company portal, what's required and what's not required. It's going to be in the deck. It's available on the site, so I won't go through this whole deck with you guys at this point. But these are those options in terms of applications and application installation requirements. So this section, planning and implementing Microsoft Intune device management solutions, really goes into knowing what Intune can do. Anybody know what DEP is? Device Enrollment Program, or the Apple DEP. They're going to ask you about that. How do I use Apple DEP to do that? The Volume Purchase Program, the VPP. How do I go about getting applications that I've certified within my organization on iOS devices to be delivered to that device? So DEP and VPP will be questions that you get asked on the exam. So at least when you're in your console, if you're reading about it, if you don't know about it now, look it up. I've kind of tried to explain it at a high level so you understand it. And then just different things like, that's actually wrong. Group type scopes and desired state configuration, those are actually a different set of tips. But nonetheless, the VPP, DEP are very important, so just keep that in mind. The next section goes into configuring networks. Again, you notice we went to identity, we went to apps, and now we did Intune. So the configuring networking is a big piece of this too. So knowing exactly what the name resolution requirements are, the wireless networking requirements are, the Windows firewall settings. Again, there's a lot in this exam, and you guys can see what I'm trying to do is make sure I cover it with you guys. Some of you guys are super experts on this end of the spectrum on certain technologies, and some of us may be looking to find out what this is. So I'm doing my best to make sure that you guys get a full picture of what you could possibly expect on this exam. So firewalls, network settings, IP settings are all part of that conversation. Some of these things are things we've always been doing for years. If you're an IT admin, if you've worked in engineering or any other place where you have to run command shell scripts or look up servers, running these commands are nothing new. These DHCP scopes, DNS, you should already be familiar with it. What you may not be as familiar with is the PowerShell commands associated with those same commands. So we can see here what I've listed is what are those differences. Because in the exam, they may ask you questions. They might throw one in that's a PowerShell command which does the exact same thing. But if you're not familiar with that context, you'll think, well, this is made up. There's no way it could possibly be there. So look up some of the PowerShell command scripts and then compare them with the command line scripts. Both still work. Some are deprecated, but both of these still work. The last command line get net IP actually should not be there, but you guys, it's not a PowerShell command. But netsh, if I need to look up, the firewall rules or pull that up, you have new ways to do it, new net firewalls, and all the way down to get net routing. All those things are ways you can actually use to find information around the network, what you're running, outside of just using the normal IP config. And if you're not using these tools today, I would actually start kind of getting used to using those PowerShell scripts as well. And this is an example of sort of a build scenario where they ask you to basically drag and drop different concepts. So what you can do when you're connecting to a wireless network and how you actually can do it, this kind of walks you through that process. This might be the steps to managing a preferred network. So you want to basically open the settings app. You might want to click the network, internet, and then click Wi-Fi on the Wi-Fi page, and then click managing Wi-Fi settings. They might walk you through what is that process that you would actually use to get to that point. So that's why, again, it's important to go into that settings app, because if you're used to doing it a different way and they start asking you what is that process, the new process that you're using now, just know what it looks like, right? I've been in a situation where you've already done it before, you know how it works, but you go in the exam room and you forget. So you're almost kind of guessing like, oh. So do it just to familiarize yourself with it. Even if you have to do it right before the exam, just run through those settings, look at them, make sure you know what they look like, because you won't have that time during the exam when you're taking it, okay? So in here, I've kind of shown just a quick manage Wi-Fi settings, what that looks like. If I were to show this real quick on my screen, and we looked at the network, internet settings, same thing here. You still have options for Wi-Fi. That's all available. Many things have been updated quite a bit, but for the most part, you still have those same settings, know where to turn those on, how to control those settings, whether I'm showing available networks or managing specific known networks. The fact that you can actually use Wi-Fi services as a new one. Later on, you'll see some of the conversation around VPN and what options you have. We'll look at that when we get there. I'm not going to go there now, but we'll come back to that in a few minutes. So the other piece that's still there is configuring and maintaining network securities. One thing you'll notice is they're taking all those features that were available in the MMC console app into the settings containers. So even this, at this point, is actually getting moved over to the settings app itself. But for the exam, just know that you still have inbound, outbound rules. If you need to create a firewall, if you need to do anything in terms of creating a security rule, this is where you'd actually do it. They might actually have you walk through that process of creating an outbound rule or selecting the right outbound rule associated with your organization or a specific IP address that you're trying to provide access or prevent access from. So just know the different types of Wi-Fi authentications and spend a little time in the console. It gives you an idea of what to expect. Now again, I might be going a little quick on some of this because I have like 6 other sections to cover, and but here's a few other tips to keep in mind. Know the commands, the ping, IP config all. You know, if you're an IT admin, many of that might not be anything new to you, but also remember just the subnetting. Networking is still a big part of this exam. It's not as heavy as we used to see it, where they're asking you specific questions. Know what your subnets, know what your gateways are, and just brush up on some of those math skills. A couple of years ago, we used to go into that a little bit more in depth in these exams, but I think you can get away with 1 or 2, maybe even 3 questions around networking that's specific to subnetting. So if it's not a huge deal, if it's not super difficult for you, you might be able to walk away with understanding how that works. As I mentioned, the MMC console using the Windows firewall with advanced security is still a big piece of this. And then remember that the DHCP, DNS, VPN components are still part of this exam. It's not like it's just a server 2016. I didn't mention the different protocols that you have, the IKE v2, LTTP, PPTP, all those are still on the exam. They're a lot of fun when you're trying to figure out which protocol is being used in this scenario. I didn't cover that here, but that's part of the networking piece. The next piece that gets covered in this exam is the configuring storage components. So this is now moving away from the hardware, moving away from the actual installation, the management, into the actual files, the applications itself. So in the storage, we're talking about distributed file systems, or DFS, what's actually located on that device itself, how I can manage it through dynamic access, how I can prevent access, how I can control access using BitLocker and BitLocker to go. So remember that some of the things that have been deprecated, for example, file replication services, or FRS, is no longer around. DFSR and DFSN are the big thing. So know the difference between, know what DFSR is replication, where you're basically replicating data from different locations, and DFR, it should say DFS, but whatever. DFS, I gotta talk to Joe, man. He keeps messing up. No, I was kidding. DFSN, which is the namespaces, is focused on replicating the actual sites or links to those namespaces so you can have access to those files. And in here, we've kind of listed out in the framework of this is namespaces where I have those different names or links to those locations across a specific network. It still requires Active Directory. It still requires a sysvol if you're using that, if you're integrating that with Active Directory. Even though you see this on the Windows Server 2012 or Windows Server 2016 exam, you'll still need to know that for the Windows devices exam, because those file systems are what users are going to be looking to have access to. So know what links are, know what the targets are, link referrals where you're pointing somebody else to a different location, root referrals where you're pointing somebody down to the core root location of where the file is located, and referral caches where the information actually stays there over time, regardless of where it's located. And then the other piece that comes up is storage pools. So storage spaces are a big part of the Windows 10 exam. Again, this is a feature that came out that's part of the Windows Server platform. You're going to be tested on it on your client machines, understanding what storage pools can be, how you can actually build storage pools, and where you can actually find that information on your devices again. So know what physical disks, the fact you can have multiple disks on your device, and you can actually pull them together, and it aggregates them all and uses it to create storage spaces. So all it's doing now is deciding what sort of disk am I going to make available on my system so that people can actually use it. If you're plugging it in and you're having multiple storage pools, it can create those disks, and you can create virtual disks or virtual drives that you can use for what you need. Know the difference between thin provisioning and thick provisioning, right? Because, you know, in some cases you might want to just do thin provisioning where all the space isn't allocated yet. In other cases where it requires that fixed requirements, you might want to have that physical space already allocated for the application or system that you're using it for. We talk about different storage layouts. So parity, stripe, how many people have dealt with storage requirements? This stuff gets kind of fun, right? You know, parity, stripe, make sure you know what those three-way mirroring, two-way mirroring, what that's all about, because they're going to just ask you that question. Again, this isn't a huge part of the exam, but just if you haven't had the chance to kind of take a look at that, that's what you want to do, is kind of spend the time on seeing what storage space is all about, and when you know what to expect if you start getting asked questions about it. Hang on just 1 second. Oh, come on back. So in here you can, I won't walk through it, but you can actually create new pools of storage spaces, but you actually need disks. If you have those disks tied into it, you'll be able to create it. In the image you can see there that it was already there, but just know where it is on your system itself, the fact that you're using it within the system's security, and that you have to have disk associated that's going to be able to pull it from. If you don't have those disks, it'll just basically tell you that they're not available. Once you have those available, you can use that to provision the storage spaces that are needed. So that piece really goes into also BitLocker. What does it take to have BitLocker running on these systems as well? So EFS, anybody know the difference between BitLocker and EFS? That's another exam tip. I'll just mention it right now. So the BitLocker itself is intended to protect the whole system, right? The actual device itself. EFS, encrypted file systems, is focused on specifically on the files themselves. So if you get an exam question that's actually about, you know, what is the protection, what type of protection you apply. If they're talking about files or folder locations, EFS becomes what you want to use. If they're talking about the whole system, then BitLocker becomes the conversation. If you're talking about a USB, BitLocker to go becomes the solution that you want to have. But you can still have EFS on top of that because it's going to really focus on the files themselves. The workplace join uses an example of encrypted file systems, right? Because it has to protect the files that are located on the server that you're using as your file server for EFS. Also remember DFS and DFSR, the replication, the fact you use it for replication, the link names, the target names, that's going to come up. And understand that you also can control access to disk based on quota management. I can decide on how much disk I give out to specific users using that quota management for hard disk, whether or not you want to have that all provisioned to a specific user or not. NTFS and NTFS permissions are still part of this exam, so anybody use RFS, resilient file systems? Anybody familiar with that, the Windows 10? The fact that that's, yeah, so it's another one of those that comes up on the exam is the resilient file systems, REFS, that you'll want to know the difference between what NTFS is and REFS. The fact that Windows 10 supports the REFS, it's just a much more resilient way of doing checks on the disk itself as opposed to NTFS, which has less checks in place. In some scenarios, it's a better option for disk management, but that's also an exam. All right, section 6, managing data access and protection. So this goes into, again, how am I accessing specific data? This is where we start seeing more and more focus on the OneDrive for business, cloud shares, home group shares, sharing access to specific data that may not reside locally on your PC. So be familiar with what that looks like from an access standpoint. You can see some of the bleed over when we're talking about disk quotas and file access and auditing and configuring authentication authorization options. everyone may have seen this one before. They're going to ask you questions around whether or not you understand the difference between file shares, local file shares, and file permissions itself. So this is an example of sharing permissions based on a network share where you only see full control, change and read on the share permissions tab. But if you're looking at the file permissions on the security tab, you have a much more robust list of options from full control all the way down to read. Know what each one of those do. If you're an IT admin that works in this space, knowing the difference between shared permissions and securities also comes in handy. And then the fact that this is all managed through the SMB, the server message blocks as part of it, whether or not you can get through or not. Even more details, you can start looking at DACs or DACLs, the dynamic access control, which also gives you the ability to control access through conditions, conditions to limit access if you're a user that's coming from a specific location, whether or not you can have access to those applications become controlled through conditional access and claims. Again, you see some of this in the ADFS components, but this is a core portion of providing access on a local machine. So when you have a chance, this is where you want to look at a file itself and look at the details between the dynamic access control and what you can actually do from a conditioning standpoint. They will be tested on this. Again, you might get 1 or 2 questions in this area, so make sure you're familiar with it. All of these different settings that we're talking about, they all have some equivalent component in policies, in group policies. And you don't need Active Directory to look at that group policies, but here's an example of where I'm looking at auditing that requirements for being able to turn on or turn off group policies. And in this example, we have audit object access. In other words, how many times, if somebody accesses a specific file that's supposed to be able to access it or not supposed to be able to access it, I can monitor that and provide responses for that in terms of failures. If I look at the event logs, that information will show up. So in this exam, they're looking to make sure you understand how you would actually do that auditing, where you'd find that information, and that's all part of the file access and access protection story that is brought up on the exam. If you haven't had a chance to look at that, look that up, make sure you understand that that's also part of deciding on who has access to specific folders or folder locations and monitoring that access as well. We get a little bit more deeper into the EFS piece, and I'll keep mentioning this, know the difference between NTFS, EFS, REFS, as well as BitLocker and EFS, because what they do is they throw all those concepts in at the same time, and they force you to try to make sure you know what each one of these are, right? Why this is different from, and a lot of people try to figure out what makes exams different than field work, what you do on a day-to-day basis. It's because in the exam, they want to make sure that you understand what the concepts are, right? When you're actually doing your day-to-day job, you may only interface with one of these concepts on a continuous basis, and that's all you see with a customer, right? Then all of a sudden, if you're lucky enough, somebody says, hey, I need to know what REFS is. You need to understand how it works. And all of a sudden, you're having to learn a new technology. They want to make sure you understand the high level of how this works. So that's what this exam will do from a standpoint of testing your knowledge. So in here, we've actually added the encrypted content to secure devices. Make sure you know what that is, what that looks like, as well as just disk quotas, as I mentioned earlier. So space, determining how you can control access to different folders. So we can see here we have the option to control quota settings on that. You can use group policies to control this as well. So dynamic access control is a big part of this. The shared permissions also is a big part of this, as well as just the home group. I didn't go over the home group piece. And printers. So if you know how to access printers and provide access to printers, that's also part of this exam. Section 10 goes into managing remote access, and this is really around remote desktop settings, RDP, and all the configurations if you're setting up an RDP environment using Windows 10. It also covers VPN requirements from, as I mentioned before, the point-to-point scenarios, the LTTP scenarios, and just knowing what the common authentication protocols are within the Windows 10 platform. This is a lot, right? This you can spend 2-3 hours on this, and it's still kind of tough to make sure you understand. So just read up on it and try to find scenarios that make sense. Look, one of the things I always try to tell folks is be familiar with what is the most secure scenario. So for example, the EAP MS Chat v2, it's a protocol that's used by EAP, which offers the default and most flexible authentication options from a usage standpoint on a Windows 10 client. And it offers just the strongest password options and things of that nature. So little things like that will help you sort of prepare. Point-to-point is an older technology, LTTP, older technology, but IKE v2 and Chat v2 AAP are the two that if you were going to pick which ones I need to understand what they do and how they work, those ones would be the ones to start with. This is just a high level of remote desktop services, what that looks like. We have the clients coming in to the web access server, and they have to break through the gateway. We have a connection broker that determines whether or not they're going to go to a specific session host, and the fact you have to have a license server, a file storage, and Active Directory. So this, in a sense, is just a drawing that kind of gives you a big picture of what that looks like if you've never worked with it before. The fact that you're going to need a connection broker, a web access server that is the interface of where the client is actually starting from in terms of accessing those desktops, the gateway that controls whether or not they're going to go to a specific set of session hosts or servers, and lastly, making sure you have enough licenses which run with Windows Server 2016. Nothing trivial here other than know the different roles that are available on Windows Server 2016 to support remote desktops. In case you get asked a question around why can't they access the system, know that maybe the connection broker server was failed and needs to be restarted, the service itself. So that's in there. The other piece to keep in mind is the remote desktop settings. Joe and I laugh all the time. The remote desktop settings, we probably use this all the time, but nobody ever pays attention to the other tabs that are available under remote desktop settings. So if I were to pull this up, one of the things that I try to do is open this up all the way. Look at the different options that are available, the fact that I can change the screen size, the fact that I can actually access local resources like printers and clipboards. We typically ignore that, the fact that you have additional drives that you can support, or even plug-and-play devices that you can plug in later, and this becomes part of your remote session as well. All the way down to detecting the different qualities of experiences that you might have. They may ask you questions about just the RDP protocol itself and how you would actually control whether or not the experience of a user would be better or worse. And then also the warn option in terms of server authentication. So you can see you have a number of different options available, including the setting of the gateway. If you have a gateway server, you can actually configure this through group policy and actually add a gateway server so that whenever a user in your organization is accessing the set of systems, they're all automatically required to go through a specific gateway server before they can access that remote desktop system. So these settings are hidden, not hidden, but people don't typically go into them. So at least go through them, look at what those settings are and how you can actually use them to prepare for the exam. We talked very briefly about this, but the sync options also are on the exam. The fact that you can turn on sync, so from device to device, all of your settings are followed across the device. You can control this through group policies again, where I can basically disable sync if I don't want the sync to happen. I can disable the use of the Microsoft account if I don't want that to happen. But these sync options, as simple as they sound, you will get tested on that. So at least take a look at them so that you know exactly what that is. So in this section, we cover managing remote apps. Remote desktop, sorry. Didn't cover the hibernate options. So how many people use PowerCFG? Yep, so PowerCFG, they'll ask you about that, what that looks like. If I want to enable hibernation, it will come up. Again, that's because sometimes you need that for Hyper-V. Other times you just want to make sure you have hibernate as an option. Or if you want to print out the report and look at the actual settings. And then remote desktop settings, just being able to pull up, the MSTSC might come up. Know the different protocols, as I mentioned earlier, as well as the use of direct access versus VPN reconnect. Now, direct access is essentially being deprecated, but you still might see questions on the exam about it. So just know that it provides access or direct access to the systems in your internal network using the protocols that allow you to do that. So managing apps. So this is section 8, and then like 2 more sections, and then open it up for questions if you guys have it, or I'll be able to show you guys some of the learning material that you can actually use. So configuring apps, this really goes into not just remote apps or anything else, but really talks about different ways you can have access to applications, as well as the application compatibility toolkit, the Windows Analyzer? I forgot. It's been some time. You can actually do the analyzation before you upgrade to Windows 10. It may be part of this exam. Now, ACT is so he mentioned ACT, but ACT is the application compatibility toolkit, but it's essentially still there, but for more modern usage, the why can't I say it right? Windows Analyzer is a newer set of tools that you can actually use. It uses the ability to determine whether or not your systems have applications that are ready to be moved, that will work when you get to Windows 10. For this exam, you'll still get questions around the ACT, which is the traditional way of finding applications that may or may not be ready for Windows 10. And know the difference between running Hyper-V and App-V at the same time. The user experience virtualization, or UEV, all of these features are now part of the Windows 10 experience. They're not necessarily sold as a different licensing model. It's all part of the Windows 10 experience. These technologies have been embedded within Windows itself, but you will still be asked questions about it based on the fact that it was part of the Configuring Windows Devices exam. And hopefully within next 6 months or so, some of these questions will have made its way out of it. Here's an example of deploying and managing like a specific remote app. I can actually put in my credentials. Again, remote app, again, is another one of those that's, at this point, it's no longer, it's still there, but it's not really, something that we're, essentially using quite extensively. So this gives you an example of how I'd set that up. You put the email address, and that information will come in, and basically you can still configure remote app to connect to a system if you needed to. Know the different sorts of ways of connecting access to applications. So you have the session-based access to remote systems. You have virtual desktops where you can actually run a VM on your VM and have specific applications running on it. And then you also have, running remote desktop services in IaaS, infrastructure as a service. And then you can also use Citrix XenApp. They bring this up because we actually have sort of a partnership with Citrix, and you can actually use that to have access to specific applications in your organization. So for this exam and for this section, just know the different ways that you can expose applications for a user that needs access to them. These are just some of those basic ways of exposing those applications if they don't run on Windows 10 or if you need access to them. In addition to that, also know what UEV does, and what it looks like. Again, UEV is the way that we basically provide the ability to sync settings, user experience virtualization, sync information about users from one system to another. So it's not necessarily the application, but the application settings, your backgrounds, your configurations for specific desktops, or even Outlook. If your signature, one of the things I used to like about UEV is it actually migrate my signatures from one machine to another. I used to hate having to reconfigure my signature, and if they captured that settings file, that information would come over to the next machine. What I've listed here is a number of different ways to run it from a PowerShell, from a command line parameter, with the agent setup process, what you would actually want to sync. Much of this has already been built into the sync options on the settings page. So so that information gets stored in a specific location on the OneDrive. It allows you to basically have that information mapped over from one location to another. So UEV is important. So for this section on the apps, App-V and UEV are essentially what they're talking about. Knowing different ways to run applications, whether it's remote apps, desktop apps, are important. ACT, as the gentleman mentioned back here, is also still as important as well, and where you do actually want to install the apps. The only piece I didn't go into detail with is deploying applications using SCCM. just know that you have different ways of delivering applications to a device. If you're already familiar with it, this should be fairly simple for you. What you do want to do is make sure you brush up on the pieces that you don't understand. Oh, and then I'll come back to, I was going to say AppX, but that's more of side-loading applications. Section 9 covers managing updates and recovery. So this is now, I've had my system running for a while, and I want to basically recover a specific file. So it goes into things like file history, recovering data from OneDrive. If I have data sitting in a OneDrive location, configuring updates policies, using Windows as a service. So this is all around just keeping the system updated or recovering information if you've lost it. And all of this is, again, part of the Windows ecosystem. They're really just testing you to make sure that you know how to get to these settings and what to look it up. Again, another tip, and I like this because all you really need to do is in this scenarios, if you're looking for anything, just type the option, right? So in here, I'm going to choose recovery drive, for example. And it kind of walks me through the process of deciding on what I want to do for a recovery drive. Do you have a USB drive plugged in? And then it basically takes that information and backs up your device on it as well. Let's look up another setting here that kind of goes into the recovery options. And here we start seeing recovery options. Some of this is continuing to change, but just know that with this exam, they're going to be looking for you to know what these options are. If I need to reset the PC for somebody, whether it's a refresh or reset the PC basically is going to wipe the device, resetting it and removing the apps. Or if I want to recover it back to the previous version, so you can do this with Windows 7 or Windows 10 and go back to the previous version because all that information gets stored on the C Windows location. And if you delete this Windows.old location, then you're you're pretty much you've got problems. But typically, it will look for that information to restore it back to your system. So that's an option. And then lastly, the option to use like a USB advanced startup option, and it'll take you into the location where you can actually decide on plugging in the USB and restoring that information. So they're going to be challenging you on that. They're also going to challenge you on the use of the backup on OneDrive as well, right? Because that's also a location where data will reside. So the thing to remember is that you can restore data from the OneDrive as well. It also has its own recycle bin as well. So if you've deleted information, if you have data that's sitting there, it will basically sit there and allow you to remove it within a month or so, depending on where the data you can actually restore it or have it available. On this is the OneDrive for Business, but the OneDrive itself, you can keep data in the recycle bin for up to a month and then restore it back in. So they're going to test you on that, not just the local drive data. So just know that those options are available for you when you're going through and reviewing your content, as well as just, in this case, you have 10 days to revert back to a previous version of Windows 10, and you can use that to basically rebuild the system. But keep in mind, you can't use a custom image, right? If it's going to use that image that's built into the Windows 10 platform. We tend to try not to change that because when you start changing that information, it makes it tougher for it to actually complete that work. The other piece that they'll test you on is knowing the difference between backups and recoveries and file history, right? File history is now focused not just on the backup, but if I have a specific, let's say just a SharePoint file, folder called SharePoint, and I continue to make changes to that folder, adding documents to it over a 1-month period, and I back it up every week, you can go back to a previous version of that, the file history, and pull that content over. But that's for specific files. So, but in order to use that feature, it has to be enabled. So you may get challenged on whether or not you use file history for a specific application. Again, I'm trying to make sure you guys have enough information so you walk into that exam. It's just, oh, I got it, This is an example of that because a lot of people don't think about file history as being that important. Know the difference between using a full backup and whether or not you just need to do a file history backup of a specific location. And I kind of gave the quick example of how you'd add a drive where you want to put the data. We might not do this on an everyday basis. I mean, how many times you guys sit around and say, oh, I got to go turn on file history. I got to use it. This at least exposes you to what it is and how it works. The other piece that comes up in this exam is Windows Update. Windows Updates the service. How do I delay Windows Updates? How do I use the servicing updates? Now, anybody know what the new name is called now? No, the actual terminology for servicing. Yeah, semi-annual channels, right? So that's, you won't see that on an exam. I just want to make sure that you guys at least, the SACs, that are done twice a year. It's a new concept. In the exam, you'll still be asked around Windows Update for Business, like you mentioned, and Windows as a service as a whole, looking at servicing updates. But just know that the name's changed. So I get a lot of questions. Well, why should I know this name and that? Just know the two names actually exist. That they're essentially the same thing, and the fact that here are your options. You can change the active hours. You can decide to delay the update. Then that becomes a delayed version of the Windows, and you can control all this through group policy, right? Again, that's another piece. They're going to look for you to understand that you can actually configure this through group policies, through Intune, through WSUS or SCCM, all different ways to control the settings that way. So feature updates, how you get them, being able to pause updates, the file recovery systems, whether or not you're using rolling back updates, and the OneDrive recycle bins are also the tips I want to make sure you guys have as you prepare for this. And then just the file history, knowing that you have previous versions of the same file. So that really just covers all of the pieces of the exam. You can see I went through everything from identity all the way to recovery. It's a lot of content. The importance of making sure this deck is available for you guys is that, as you're preparing, I want you to be able to pick the sections that make sense. We also have some that have notes in it that it helps you look that information up. But more importantly, use the labs. Get in there. We all have Windows 10 running, of course, and if you don't want to mess it up, use the labs, run the systems, try to figure out what you can do with them to basically take advantage of it. And again, just review. If you guys have any, I have a couple links here of different recordings. Here's where we placed all the information and made available for you. So again, there's a lot of information. If you do have questions, anybody have any questions while I'm standing up here? Too much info, right? Oh, one question, go ahead.
If you're already got an MCSA Windows 8.1, you only require one exam for the Windows 10 MCSA.
For the MCSA, you still have to follow the same path. They're going to.
You're only required to take the 697. You don't have to take the 698 exam.
If you have it, yes, that's correct. That's correct. So if it's a lot of people haven't gotten there yet, but if you do, that's the case. You can actually go around that path. So here, let me just show you guys something really quickly before we end. Just for those of people that, just make sure you go into the My Certification Planner, and what you'll see in this is just a path, that allows you to basically take advantage of figuring out what you need to do to prepare yourself for exam certifications. It gives you options and decisions from a preparation standpoint of what you need to, how you can make progress. So mcp.microsoft.com gives you that information. Just great content to kind of prepare for the exam. So with that, I don't want to take up any more of the time. I know we're at the top of the hour. I just want to say thanks for staying for the whole session, and obviously feel free to come up and if you have questions and ask from here. So thanks guys, and enjoy the rest of Ignite.